Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Kai, and in this video I present information from an article written by Professor Dr Ekrem Ekinci of the Faculty of Law at Marmara University in Turkey, titled Fratricide in Ottoman Law. For those who do not know what fratricide means, it is the killing of one's own brothers, and in the case of the Ottomans, also including their male descendants. You can find the link to the full article by Ekinci in this video and also in the description. My interest in this presentation is to focus more on the key points relevant for Islamic law than it is the finer points of history of the Ottoman Empire. You can read Ekinci's article if you want the fuller historical context. That fratricide occurred among the Ottoman nobility when a new sultan came to power is very well known. What is less commonly known, even among Muslims, is that this manner of succession was regarded as being in accordance with Islamic law, or Sharia. Despite the prevalent view that fratricide was a uniquely Ottoman cultural deviation from Islamic norms, the fact is that Muslim scholars did indeed find ways to demonstrate its accordance with Sharia. Even though some may argue that Sharia does not explicitly endorse fratricide, nevertheless, the Ottomans framed the issue as one of permissibility intimately related to the necessities of siyasa, or political governance. Before diving into the topic, we must recognize something Ekinci points out in his article. Quote, "The subject must be evaluated from a more rational objective point of view, unlike some historians who considered fratricide to be motivated by bloodthirsty greed for power. Ottoman practice of fratricide was born out of necessity, and with the passing away of this said necessity, they did away with this practice." End quote. In his article, Ekinci presents three categories of fratricide. The first category encompasses individuals who have openly rebelled against the Sultan. In this instance, brother or not, rebellion against the Sultan is not permissible and is grounds for capital punishment. The second category encompasses individuals who can be discerned as being an imminent threat to the Sultan, for example, actively planning and organizing a rebellion, but who haven't yet actually rebelled. There is a difference of opinion among Muslim scholars whether such individuals are subject to capital punishment. Nevertheless, it is well established that there are scholarly opinions in favor of capital punishment for these individuals. The third category encompasses individuals who pose no imminent threat to the Sultan, but are perceived to pose an existential threat merely due to their noble lineage connected to the Sultanate. A threat was likely to materialize at some point in the future, as history demonstrates to be the case. The first two categories were already well treated by Muslim scholars historically and had jurisprudential rulings prior to the Ottomans. But the third category was an altogether new situation with the advent of the Ottoman Empire, which necessitated new rulings under Islamic law. What the Ottomans needed was justification under Islamic law for the Islamic State to kill innocent Muslims. The nuance of the third category of fratricide is that the people killed were not punished for a crime, whether committed or in contemplation or active potential. So their killing was not one of capital punishment per se. The Ottomans had to find a way so that Islamic law justified the killing of innocent Muslims by the Islamic State. The solution was arrived at by applying the jurisprudential principle known as maslaha, which encompasses rulings arrived at for the common benefit of the Muslim community at large. While maslaha has historically been recognized as an essential principle of jurisprudence, it should be noted that it is not a principle of jurisprudence shared universally among all the accepted schools. For example, the Shafi'i school rejects it. But irrespective of whether or not maslaha is universally accepted among the various jurisprudential schools within Islam, the fact is it is a principle historically recognized and accepted within mainstream Sunni Islam. Ekinci in his article highlights that the Turkish states of the Huns, Gökturks, Uyghurs, Karahans, Ghaznavids, Timurids, Baburids, and Seljuks all collapsed due to competing interests among the nobility of a several states governance model. The Ottomans, not wanting their state to likewise collapse, deemed it necessary to eliminate the several states governance model and multiplicity in nobility. Fratricide, according to the Ottomans, was the means by which to eliminate competing interests and guarantee the longevity of a single powerful Islamic state that could further the expansion of Islam. Avoiding dissolution of the state, therefore, was of paramount importance. And though fratricide was looked upon as a kind of evil, it was a necessary evil, or a lesser of two evils, aimed at preservation of the Islamic State for the greater good. Moreover, the Ottomans did not believe in designation of the succeeding sultan along immediate hereditary lines, for example, succession defaulting to the eldest son, for the reason that other noble candidates may be better suited for the sultanate. Rather than put the longevity of the empire at risk by having an inferior candidate rise to the rank of sultan, competition among viable claimants to the throne was seen as Allah selecting the person best able to govern the Islamic State. In other words, fratricide was regarded as the material working out of divine providence. In his code, or Qanun, Mehmed the Conqueror enshrined the Islamic legality of fratricide. Quote, fratricide, for Nizami Alam, or the common benefit of the people, is acceptable for any of my descendants who ascends the throne by God's decree. The majority of the ulama, or Muslim scholars, permits the fratricide. End quote. Ekinci highlights in his article that the Ottomans did not restrict fratricide to just brothers. For the Ottomans, fratricide included all male descendants of brothers as well. Mehmed's code also demonstrates that the Ottomans considered the Sultanate a theocratic Islamic institution. Ekinci goes on to provide historical examples of preemptive action. For example, Muhammad putting a person in prison on the charge of theft only to be released upon discovery of his innocence. The second Caliph Umar exiling Nasr bin Hajjaj from Medina to Basra, though the latter had not committed any offense. Umar is quoted as saying, "You are not guilty, but if tumult appears because of you in the future, I will be guilty." And also when an item is left with a person and it is unwillingly destroyed, the person with whom the item was left does not have to make reparations. Instead, the Caliphs Umar and Ali judged that it was the responsibility of the craftsman to repay for the damaged item due to maslaha. Ekinci also notes that part of maslaha is the principle of sada zarai, which dictates that the road to harm be cut off. This concept is applied to siyasa, or political governance of the Islamic State. In this context, the principle of sada zarai means that preventative measures, namely the killing of innocent Muslims by the Islamic State, are to be understood as necessary precautions rather than punishments. Muslim scholars even cite the Quran in support of taking preemptive action. Ekinci writes, quote, Ibn Abidin, one of the latest prominent scholars of law in the Ottoman Empire, says in the chapter on Ta'zir of his famous book Rad al-Mukhtar, it has been mentioned in Nasafi's Ahkam al-Siyasa that Sheikh al-Islam Khakhrizadeh was asked about the execution of mischief makers while they are not active. He replied that their business is to incite tumult, even when they are not active. As they are potential instigators of tumult and anarchy, it is permissible to kill them. We understand this from the Quran, Surah 6 verse 28, which declares, "They," meaning the mischief makers, "will certainly stick to the things they are forbidden, even if they were to come back to the world once more." There are two verses in the Quran conveying the meaning that fitna is worse than slaughter. The historian Bosnevi Hussein Effendi and Sheikh al-Islam Khoja Saad ad-Din Effendi explained clearly that fratricide was applied in accordance with the mentioned verses of the Quran. It is narrated in Quran 18:80-81 that the friend of the Prophet Musa killed an innocent child. Musa had asked him, "Have you killed an innocent person who had killed none?" And he had replied, "The parents of the boy were believers, and we feared lest he should instigate them by rebellion and disbelief. So we intended that their Lord should change him for them for one better in righteousness and closer to mercy." End quote. As for the legal justification of fratricide, Ekinci cites two famous Ottoman historians. Quote, "It is possible to see the legality of the fratricide among the main principles of Islamic law. Two famous Ottoman historians, Karamani Mehmed Pasha and Sheikh al-Islam Khoja Saad ad-Din Effendi, cite some of these principles in an attempt to justify fratricide. Some of these cited principles are as follows. In order to prevent the common harm, the personal harm is preferred. The greater harm is removed by means of the lesser harm. When two harms are encountered, an attempt is made to prevent the greater harm by committing the lesser. The lesser of the two harms is preferred, and the removal of a harm is better than obtaining a benefit. These principles also had been reiterated in the Articles 26 through 30 of Ottoman Civil Code known as Majalla al-Ahkam al-Adliya several centuries later." End quote. The practice of the Islamic State killing innocent Muslims for the greater good is also cited by Ekinci as an example found in books of Islamic jurisprudence. Quote, "The enemy captured Muslims and kept some of them as targets on their front line. Under normal circumstances, it is not permissible to kill an innocent person. But if no shooting occurs, in order to avoid killing these captives, the enemy will invade the country and kill the people, including those captives. Therefore, these innocent captives must be shot. There is a common benefit here." End quote. Now, there definitely are opinions that deem Ottoman fratricide un-Islamic, as Ekinci points out. Quote, "Some contemporary legal historians believe that fratricide is based only on the Orfi Hukuk, but contrary to the Sharia principles. They regard the evidences given to show the validity of the fratricide as groundless. Punishing a person who is suspected of planning to commit a crime in the future is unlawful, and the general principle of fitna is worse than killing cannot always be applied due to the principle of everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Furthermore, they argue that it is not correct to base the fratricide on the principle of zarurat, or necessity, maslaha, common benefit, and istiqsan, or juristic preference, because the lack of a potential harm is at best imagined. Mumju points out that fratricide in this instance can be viewed as political execution and thus has a precedent as it exists in law. A cooperation of Islamic law and Orfi Hukuk occurs here. Others claim that the practice of fratricide is undefendable from a humane and Islamic justice viewpoint. They go on to point out that the state of affairs during this period made this practice unavoidable and that the dynasty was forced to take this prescription so that both the government and the union would not be divided. Alderson argues that the application of fratricide for the sake of preserving the empire is an extreme method and that it was implemented so that a single powerful ruler could rule without the potential threat of loss of land. Ismail Hamid Danishmed argues that this practice, when viewed from a modern lens, may seem to be a tragic tradition. However, the constant infighting and struggles between the Shahzades for power heavily influenced the application of fratricide, which prevented the future uncertainty and gridlock that had often occurred in the past." End quote. That contradictory and irreconcilable legal opinions exist in Islam is nothing new. Anyone who studies Islamic jurisprudential texts knows that mutually exclusive rulings abound on every topic. But just because some scholars give the opinion that Ottoman fratricide is un-Islamic does not make it un-Islamic. Moreover, you have Muslim scholars that not only deem the practice Islamic, but even praise it. For example, consider what Ekinci writes. Quote, "The historians who were also great scholars in law, such as Sheikh al-Islam ibn Kamal, declared that fratricide was politically right and legal. Similarly, as a jurist, Kazasker, or Supreme Qadi, Bostanzadeh Yahya Effendi, author of the book Tarikh-i-Saf, approves and even praises Sultan Mehmed III for killing his brothers for the common benefit, or Nizam-e-Alim. Solakzadeh, an Ottoman historian, says so. Nizhanjazadeh, Ottoman jurist and historian, says that Shahzadeh Yaqub was executed because the availability of multiple princes enables the public to think about who should become the next sultan." End quote. And also, quote, "Mari bin Yusuf, a Hanbali scholar, considers fratricide as one of the virtues of the Ottoman dynasty. He states that the dynasty executes their own children lest a revolt which breaks out among Muslims and the state falls into disorder. Although this is in opposition to common sense, the execution provides great benefit. The execution is similar to giving a fatwa regarding the execution of 3 people in order to protect the lives of 30 people. He expresses that when there is no clear evidence for the revolt of the princes, the probability, or zan, is replaced by certainty, or yaqeen. He points out that these executions are due to politics, siyasa, but not the sharia, attributing the saying, "the door of siyasa is larger than that of sharia," to Ibn Uqayl. He approved it. He supplies proof from Qarafi's remarks on Al-Walaya al-Mazalim and Ibn Taymiyyah's remarks on As-Siyasa Sharia, while reconciling the two people in Al-Walaya al-Mazalim, prima facie evidence and witnesses which are not considered in the Qadi courts are taken into consideration. He points out the principle of preferring the lesser of the two evils. He mentions the execution of Shahzadeh Mustafa by Sultan Suleiman. He narrates the collapse of the Moroccan Sultanate due to the lack of fratricide in the Sultanate. Ekinci continues and says something absolutely critical. The reservations regarding the lawfulness of fratricide arise as a result of the inferred difference between political and Sharia law resulting from modern thought. However, classical thought does not differentiate between the two. Many As-Siyasa Sharia books have been written to prove this very point, as Islamic sources are not exclusive to the Quran and Sunnah. To equate fratricide with homicide would be a superficial understanding of Sharia." End quote. The Muslim belief in a plurality of jurisprudential rulings on the same topic being a mercy or even blessing from Allah as a means to encourage and foster Muslim unity, meaning not to disunite over disagreements on jurisprudential issues, is a double-edged sword. In reality, having a plurality of conflicting rulings is part and parcel of Islam. As long as a ruling is arrived at using authentic sources and sound, recognized principles of jurisprudence, then it is an Islamically valid opinion. Muslim scholars give their legal opinions to the Sultan, all of which are correct, as they are all justified using established principles of jurisprudence with authentic sources, and the Sultan selects the opinion that he deems is in the best interests of the Islamic State. But what the issue ultimately boils down to is that the matter of Ottoman fratricide is not a hypothetical. It was a historical reality. It was a historical reality committed by Muslims to Muslims and justified by Muslims for Muslims. Ottoman fratricide had nothing to do with non-Muslims. It was an internal Muslim affair and ultimately deemed Islamic. But all this speaks to a larger point that Muslims of today for the most part fail to grasp from anti-Islam critics. It is a fanciful idea to think that any one person or group can definitively point and say, such and such over here is what Islam really teaches, while such and such over there is not what Islam teaches. That's not how Islam functioned historically, nor how it is structured to function. Contradictions within Islam and differing implementations of Islamic practice are the hallmark features of the religion. It's what makes Islam Islam. It is inherent to Islam that Muslims can recite the Quran differently, using different words with different meanings for the same verses. It is inherent to Islam that Muslims can pray with their hands dangling at the sides or folded across their front side. It is inherent to Islam for the Caliph to be established through recognition by the community, as was the case of Abu Bakr, to direct appointment, as was the case with Umar, to pseudo-democratic election, as was the case with Uthman. Historical reality is clear. From the outset, Muslims have always differed in what they believe, have always differed how they practice Islam, and have always implemented differing manners of governance among themselves. Moreover, Islam is not just hypotheticals tucked away in books on a shelf. History tells us what Islam is, and when we look to history, the facts are undeniable. The Ottomans engaged in fratricide, and Muslim scholars used the Quran, Sunnah, and recognized jurisprudential principles to legally justify doing so. Like it or not, agree with it or not, Ottoman fratricide was Islamic.